Hello, everyone, and welcome to the program, A Journey Through Nature and Science. With us today, we have Dr. Kenneth Monahan. He's a renowned expert in stroke rehabilitation with over 32 years of clinical, academic, and research experience in Ireland mainly. As a lecturer in health science and director of the Neuroplasticity Research Group at Atlantic Technological University, he's really at the forefront of developing innovative physical rehabilitation solutions that can be implemented in a patient's own home. Kenneth's mission is to empower stroke survivors to achieve the best possible recovery by optimizing their home environment for physical rehabilitation. With his expertise in digital health technology, remote rehabilitation systems, and neurology rehabilitation, he is really revolutionizing the way stroke patients receive care and support after leaving the hospital. Kenneth is also the lead inventor of two very successful United Kingdom international patents for innovative rehabilitation devices, and we'll hear a little bit more about that as we get into this discussion. He serves on the board of directors for the Neurology Support Centre charity and is a former editor and current editorial board member of Physiotherapy Practice and Research International Journal. So, Dr. Ken, welcome to the program. I'm so excited to have you on the program to talk about stroke rehabilitation and in-home care.
Yeah, thank you very much, Don, for inviting me to come. It's a great opportunity just to discuss the work that we're doing. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. So, Ken, why don't we get started and you tell us a little bit about this journey you're on and what started you on this journey? Was there some epiphany or some aha moment back in your childhood or life that started you off on this journey?
Well, I suppose I'm 32 years qualified as a physical therapist in America or a physiotherapist in the UK. And I've probably had two careers, Don. The first 16 years of my life, I would have specialized in musculoskeletal physiotherapy. So, we're, looking after people that have disc problems in their neck and back, or sore shoulders and those kind of injuries. And I would have specialized in sports medicine actually for a lot of years, where I worked with semi-professional teams and I specialized and did a master's in sports medicine. And eventually I actually was lecturer in University College Dublin, and my own PhD research was actually about ankle injuries. It was about how you solve the problem of chronic ankle instability. So if you sprain your ankle, there's almost 50% chance that you'll sprain it again. So it's a big problem. But about 16 years ago, I became very aware of an unusual therapy, or an innovative therapy at that time. It was called mirror therapy. And I found it fascinating because it originally had been used for patients who'd had phantom limb pain, and it seemed to be like a miracle cure for them. And because of the way mirror therapy worked, people were starting to use it for stroke patients. And around that time, a big change in my life, because I went to a particular Christmas party night with a very famous singer in Ireland called Joe Dolan. And there I met my wife, and that started the journey of me moving from Dublin, which is on the east coast of Ireland, to the northwest coast, to Donegal, where I now live. And then I changed universities, so I'm now within the Atlantic Technological University. And I started to build a research group around that time, very much focusing on therapies that I thought could help stroke patients or neurology patients. One incident actually that's probably worth mentioning was that when I moved to where I live now, I was asked to see what we call a GP, a general practitioner in Ireland, or a kind of physician, a local doctor who'd just had a stroke and had been discharged home from hospital. His wife had phoned me because she'd heard that I was very interested in this area. And I suppose when I went to his home, I saw for the first time, and I've seen this so many times since, I saw a very angry, kind of frustrated person with almost like a black cloud over his head, because there was very little supports, very little services being given to him now that he was discharged. he had a lot of ideas about how he could rehabilitate himself because he was a doctor and he knew about physiology, he knew obviously about stroke, but there was nobody to allow him have to give him the license to kind of actually become actively involved in his therapy. And over the course of a few months with Dr. Frank McCurtain, and incidentally, I dedicate my book to Frank because this was such an inspiring man. I saw that we could use some of the innovative therapies that we were developing in our research lab. We could use them in a very cost-effective way in somebody's home, and we formed a very brilliant relationship. And his recovery became very successful, and it was a very good insight to me that there was obviously a need for something that might help him and help his wife and family to have more confidence and look forward more to kind of coming home. So that probably was the moment when I really put a lot of effort into building a bigger research group, and eventually the Lights, Mirrors, Action book came from that, I suppose.
So having a kind of a personal interaction with someone that had a stroke was something that inspired you to get deeper into this and really led you to along this path in a more permanent way. So why don't we tell our listeners right here in the beginning exactly what two things that you mentioned I want you to say a little bit more about, and that's what is a stroke, and then you mentioned mirror therapy, which we discussed a little bit earlier. I'd like to have you communicate to our listeners what mirror therapy is, how it came about. There's an interesting history behind that that's really kind of important.
Yeah.
And we got to pause here for just a second. I got to get rid of my dog. Okay, so yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about mirror therapy and actually what a stroke is?
Yeah, so a stroke essentially is where oxygen has been cut off or deprived from different parts of your brain for normally two particular reasons. 85% of people, Don, who have a stroke, it's because one of the blood vessels that supplies the brain has been blocked. So they get a little clot of some sort that stops that from going. And so different parts of the brain can be deprived of oxygen and become damaged. And then the other 15%, approximately, they can have a bleed in the brain. Sometimes they have a ruptured artery, and you've heard of a subarachnoid hemorrhage or a bad brain bleed. And that also, because the blood seeps into the brain tissue, it also deprives it of oxygen and damages it. And both of those two things probably are the main causes of stroke. Statistically wise, in Ireland, 10,000 people every year have a stroke, and in America, 1 million people every year have a stroke, approximately. And of those, it is big numbers. And actually, there's the rule of thirds with stroke. A third of people, after they have a stroke, they'll get pretty much an immediate recovery, and they get a full recovery and back to normal. A third of those people will actually die because of the stroke. And then the middle group is the group that we concentrate a lot on, the people that are left with different disabilities, be they physical, cognitive, emotional, sometimes mental health issues. So that's the group that we are advancing therapies for. And one of those therapies, which we've spent a lot of time in our labs researching, is a thing called mirror therapy. So for your listeners, imagine, Don, that your two arms are up on the table in front of you now, and imagine that you've had a stroke where your left hand and your left fingers can't move. So it would have been a right-sided stroke. It would have been damage on the right side, leading to weakness on your left side. And imagine that I take a mirror and I stand it vertically between your two hands, so it's sideways. And imagine that the reflective part of the mirror is actually facing your good hand, the right hand, the one that actually can move. And the non-reflective side is facing the hand that can't move. And if you move your body and your head so that you can look around and can see the reflection in the mirror, you'll see an image of your good hand. But when you look in the mirror, it looks like it is your left hand. And that's what your brain very quickly believes. And when you watch, so if you move your good hand and you're watching the reflection of that in the mirror, your brain essentially, becomes tricked, fooled into believing that the left hand is working. And of course, it's the sensory, it's the visual feedback, the visual information that you see from the image of your good hand moving. That's the information that goes up to your brain and, desensitizes it or creates new pathways that potentially lead to better neuroplasticity. And for some people, this can be almost like a miracle cure. And obviously for others, they may not get the same level of benefits. But our trials over the years have always shown that people get some benefit, some brilliant and some maybe very minor. But definitely it's a therapy that, you can purchase a mirror for $10 or $15 on Amazon. You can also spend maybe up to $50 buying some of the specially made mirror boxes, and all of them allow you to do the same thing, to try these therapies. And what we've concentrated on in our research lab is combining that mirror therapy with other therapies to see if you can enhance the benefits from them. And we've been doing that, and we might talk about other therapies. There's 2 other therapies that are very interesting, and I'll mention them a little bit later. But the last thing you said earlier, that mirror therapy wasn't developed for stroke, funnily enough. It was developed for a condition called phantom limb pain. So again, we'll use you as an example, but imagine that you lost your left hand in an accident. Well, there's probably a 95% chance that you'll end up with phantom limb pain because your brain is struggling. All of that sensory information that goes up every millisecond of every day, that goes up and tells your brain where that limb is in space. Because it's missing, the brain really struggles with that, and it manifests itself as pain. And also people imagine that the limb is there, this phantom that they talk about. So this brilliant Indian researcher back in the early 90s, Ramachandran, he developed, or he thought that something like a mirror placed in front of the limb that was missing, and looking at the reflection of the good hand in the mirror may have potential. And it proved to be that way, because when patients used it, it was almost instantaneously a brilliant cure, and it desensitized and stopped people having phantom limb pain. And of course, then over the decades, people proposed that this may have a benefit for stroke patients as well, because just like we spoke earlier on. So again, it's not a miracle cure. For some people, brilliant results. Some other people, not so good. But definitely it's a therapy that's very easy to adapt for your home circumstances. So I'm always surprised that a lot of people don't know about mirror therapy, because it's quite common in Ireland. But definitely talking to patients around the world, or talking to family members, there's a lot that have never heard of it. So it's great to have an opportunity to even mention it to people.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're talking about this, because I had never heard of this, and I think I communicated to you. My brother had a stroke. Unfortunately, he's since passed away, and it was on the right side of his brain, and his left hand was incapacitated. He wasn't a very good patient for a number of reasons, which we don't need to go into here. But he had these same kind of symptoms that you're describing. So I'm very familiar with that. And we did have him at home most of the time, but unfortunately, not rehabilitation home care that you're describing here. Which I think if we'd have known about it, would have been very helpful. Which is why I want to have you on the program communicating this to people, because I think people need to know about these kinds of therapies that are out there.
It is, and last week, coincidentally, was World Stroke Week, World Stroke Day, or maybe 2 weeks ago, 29th of October was World Stroke Day, so there was quite a lot of opportunities to talk about, rehabilitation and things. And we had a patient of ours that was involved in our trials back in 2016 was asked to speak on one of the radio shows. And this man, he actually only came to us 6 months after he had a stroke, and his left hand, coincidentally, had no movement, and his fingers had no movement. And almost instantly, 2 or 3 sessions after he used the mirror therapy, he started to have flickers of movement in his hand. And within 8 or 9 weeks, he had 90% function, and still has to this day. So he was a great example, not just of somebody that benefited from mirror therapy, but also, I suppose, that myth that people think that if you don't get your recovery within a certain length of time after your stroke, then you're kind of finished, that your opportunity is gone. And of course, we know now, because of functional MRI scanners and things, we know that that's not true. And that's probably a very important message to tell people, to give people motivation and hope. You can recover anytime after a stroke, and neuroplasticity, that ability of your brain to change itself, that process happens all the time, every millisecond, every day. Your brain is changing because you're involved in this chat and conversation, and likewise my brain is changing as well because of everything that's going on. But a lot of people from my conversations over the years don't know that. And of course, I think if you're sitting in a rehabilitation hospital, or you're in an acute hospital, and you've just been told that you're going to be discharged home, which should be a very positive thing for you, because you wouldn't be discharged home unless you were of a certain functional level. If you don't know that your brain has that capacity, then it's probably hard for you to have the best motivation and the best belief systems inside you to give you the best chance of creating an environment. And that's kind of what we're finding out nowadays, which is interesting.
Well, when you use the word neuroplasticity, you are talking about the ability of the brain to continually improve and adapt and change. And you were saying, every millisecond of every day, the brain is active and is changing.
Yes. I suppose because of functional MRI scanners now, you can objectively see that that the brain is changing its structure. So the brain can change in two ways. It can actually regrow new cells that take on function, or existing parts of the brain can take over the function of parts that don't work. So that mapping of the brain, which is very interesting, those two things seem to happen, and both probably collectively are within the term of neuroplasticity. For your listeners, just as an aid, there's a man called Norman Doidge, and that's spelled Doidge, and Norman Doidge has written two what I think are fascinating, unbelievable books. The first one is called How the Brain That Changes Itself, and the second is The Brain's Way of Healing. And when I found his book back around that time, that first book, I found it absolutely fascinating, because it was like, that Oliver Sacks, that was kind of that legendary neurologist that used to report on case studies of unusual treatments. Norman does exactly the same. So he talks about neuroplasticity, and he talked about, one of his chapters talked about mirror therapy and a lot of different other innovative things that he had found on his travels around the world. And we started to use that then as a template a little bit, because a lot of the projects that I subsequently ran in my research lab, they were based on what his findings and suggestions were. And his book is a very easy read. So for anybody that's fascinated about neuroplasticity, that would be an excellent starting point. His opening, the opening chapter, or the introduction to his book, even just that alone is a great insight, and it's a very, very well described.
Right. Well, you just dispelled, I think, a common myth that's still very prevalent out there, and that's that brain cells don't heal themselves, or they don't reproduce, or once they're injured, you're never going to get them back, and that kind of thing. And it sounds like that's just not accurate, completely accurate.
No, it seems that, our brain cells are very like our skin cells and our bone cells. People also think that our bones grow till we're 18 or 19, and then they stop growing, and depending on how active we are, they lose strength or not. But our brain cells, our bone cells, every day of our lives, we create new bone cells, we create new skin cells, and we create new brain cells, but also we absorb old ones into our, they're lost as well. So I suppose in a healthy metabolism, there's a balance there. But just to know that fact, because when I started off 32 years ago, our neurology classes, we were very much told that 6 to 9 months maximum was really the key time frame, that if you didn't get your recovery within that time, you probably were unlikely to get it. And let's be upfront as well, that if a patient, if a stroke survivor doesn't move their limbs within, over the course of a few weeks, never mind months after they have a stroke, they will develop, rigidity and very stiffness in the tissues. And if that happens, then it is it's almost impossible that you can send all the electricity and all the information down to those limbs after that, but you definitely are going to struggle to really get any substantial benefit. But for people that keep the limbs supple and do kind of regular stretching and movements, or if they have people that can help them with that, you have to realize that there's always the possibility of recovery. And all of the stroke associations nowadays, and actually around the time, so all of the stroke associations are advocating this, and they're very definite, and they've very much written this into their new guidelines, that recovery can happen at any time after a stroke, which is a very positive message. Around the time that I was finishing up my book, probably in March or April, the Irish and the United Kingdom stroke associations had come out with their updated guidelines, and it was a brilliant moment for me, because those guidelines very specifically said that recovery, neuroplasticity takes place at any time. And very much they were also advocating for the first time that repetitive practice, if you can motivate somebody to do lots and lots of kind of, exercises and techniques and activities that benefit you, that's what has to be encouraged nowadays. And they even went so far as to suggest that a stroke survivor should kind of aim to do maybe even 2 to 3 hours of therapy, if maybe little bouts of therapy, so 20 minutes and then a good rest period, maybe another 20 minutes and another rest period, and that they should be willing to try and become actively involved in their therapies, in terms of trying out different therapies and find out the ones that are suitable for them.
You're mentioning something I think really important here, and that's that the involvement of the patient themselves. And I know we talked about that a little bit earlier. You just said encouraging the patient to be involved, but it also brings to mind the fact that the motivation of the patient has to be there. And again, my example with my brother, there was just no motivation there. No matter what we did, we couldn't get him to be motivated to exercise or to do anything. In fact, he was resistant to doing that. And so you talk about this concept of self-belief, and in these therapies and so the question becomes, if you are a caregiver, what do you do to help a resistant patient, for example, develop this self-belief, because it can be a really big challenge. I mean, we can put all the information out there you want, and if the patient's not interested and doesn't cooperate, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I suppose it's the skill, or what you're trying to do is it's how you impart the information to them, I think, is what I'm reading in research. So first of all, my experience would be that every person that's had a stroke and their family members, they're looking for this perfect therapy that will get them better. And I completely understand that. And unfortunately, the internet is a brilliant thing, but sometimes it can be a little bit unhelpful, because when we go on the internet, we'll see these people that have a miracle recovery after a stroke, and we'll naturally go and see what did they use, because we'll think then that's the thing that's going to get us better. And of course, for every miracle cure person on the internet, there's 1,000 stroke survivors whose cure and whose recovery will be slow and progressive. And we need to make sure that people realize that, because if your brother is sitting at home and he realizes that, his recovery is much slower than somebody he sees on the internet, that makes you think then that your recovery is not good, and it probably doesn't help your belief systems. But why I was mentioning the therapies is that, from my experience, and in one way why I wrote the book, is that the starting point is very much to try and change your stroke survivors' beliefs. If you're sitting in that hospital and you're waiting 2 weeks before you go home, and you think, number one, that that your recovery can only happen after a certain length of time, well, then that needs to be explained to you, that that's not the case. If you're thinking as well that your home is not a good place to do your rehabilitation, well, that's completely untrue as well, and that information needs to be told to you in a certain way, not lectured to you, but there's a certain way. They describe it as belief-based statements that we need to make for people. So we kind of insinuate things to people, and the third thing that stroke survivors will also disbelieve is they'll think, because you, Don, you're not a physiotherapist or a physical therapist or an occupational therapist, they'll think then that you're not a suitable person to help them in their recovery, which is, again, completely untrue. So from what I read about belief systems, and one of the chapters in my book talks about this brilliant milkshake study, which proves that our brains are very like pharmacies, and if our brain believes something, it creates chemicals, growth factors, hormones in our body to reflect that. And why I mentioned that is because when we know that, then we know that if you have a positive belief in your mind and you're looking forward to going home, and you really believe that you have the chance of making a recovery, well, you create an environment that's positive, that possibly helps with that. You probably release more testosterone into your body as such. So if you have a negative belief system, probably the best you can do as a caregiver or a family member is you can make what they call belief-based statements all the time when you're around your stroke person. Now, belief-based statements aren't there lecturing and telling them actual academic facts, about, but it's suggestions. It's suggesting that, your home is a brilliant place. All the time you get an opportunity, you have to be saying, look, and I was reading today how important it is for family members to come in, neighbours to come in, and, your recovery apparently is better the more exercises you do. Your recovery in home is a brilliant place. These suggested messages have to be kind of coming in. What I suggest people do before they do their therapies is they do what I call pre-expectation priming of them, so that you make the person kind of just state positive statements about the therapies they're about to take. So it's kind of like advertising. Pharmaceutical companies advertise medicines all the time, and that's kind of like priming that's done by them, so that when you get the medicine, you're already primed. I think that medicine in the future, and therapies in the future, it'll become mandatory that your doctor will say to you, before you take this new tablet, Don, you have to go on the internet, you have to go on to this website that I've created, and you have to listen to a video that describes why this new medicine will work, and and improve your understanding of how it works. And you have to do that before you're allowed to get your medicine, so that you benefit from that placebo effect, and that enhances the benefit of actually getting the therapy afterwards. So nobody has kind of the definite instructions as to how you're going to take somebody like your brother and 100% change them from that negative mindset, or possibly negative mindset, to a definitely positive one. But we do this a lot. This idea of positive belief-based statements is definitely a good starting point, because everybody, based on your thought, your beliefs, you kind of talk to yourself, and you create images in your mind, and they're either positive or negative. So the only way you can dilute those things is have your stroke survivor hearing positive messages, as much as possible. And positive messages that are said in a very relaxed way that just insinuates that what they're doing, can be very good for them. And, we do this with our kids sometimes ourselves, where I think a good example of it is our daughter at the moment. She's not putting herself forward for trials for a certain football team or whatever. And I know that it's a very difficult decision for her to do. And we think that she just wouldn't. She physically, she probably needs to be a little bit stronger. And we think that maybe it's better for her to leave it this year. But it's very difficult for her to do that. But we don't want to come out and say to her, no, you're not allowed to do them, because then she would hold that against us. But what we do a lot is any opportunity we have, we'll say a positive thing. So it's like, you know what, you really made a good decision here, not going for those trials. Or, you know what, I heard that all the girls that went for those trials, they were huge, they were physically very big. And I know that you'll have a greater chance, this year, with the stress levels and all those things. So we insinuate, and it's always going into her brain. And hopefully someday it'll be kind of, in reinforcing for her that the decision that she might have found difficult to make, it might make it a bit easier. I don't know.
Well, there seems to be a lot of psychology involved in this as well. So, caregivers also have to have a little bit of understanding of psychology and how to communicate and all of these kinds of things. And I understand your book, really helps people understand the kinds of things that you're talking about here. But you also talked about the chemical aspect of this and the fact that, and I was very interested in this, the fact that when you're in your home and you're in that kind of positive environment, it stimulates, certain chemicals. And you mentioned the hormone testosterone in particular. I mean, how does that work? What does testosterone do to help improve stroke patients' either attitude or their eventual progressive recovery? How does that work?
So there's a good friend of mine. He's Professor Ian Robertson in Trinity College, John. And Ian is a psychologist, and he's written a number of fascinating books. But one of them is called The Winner Effect. The Winner Effect, and he has a chapter in there that discusses exactly what you said there, that when we're in our own homes, so because of the sights, the sounds, the smells, the familiarity with it, our bodies release significantly more testosterone in our bodies. And testosterone is that rebuilding hormone that helps us to kind of rebuild ourselves and become stronger. So it's just one of the feeling is that when that's happening inside your body and you're trying to make a recovery alongside of whatever is released from your brain from having a positive attitude, that it helps your brain to perhaps create more cells in a better way, or it helps you to kind of have a better advantage towards creating better neuroplasticity. It certainly helps you to be a little bit stronger and possibly have more energy and things like that. So it's probably one of the things that nobody would know about. And look, it makes sense, because I suppose we all feel comfortable. We kind of feel we have a better self-efficacy when we're in our own homes because we're familiar, So
Sure,
just even knowing that.
Understand and so if any person, I mean, if a woman hears this and hears about testosterone, because usually we think of estrogen with women, testosterone with men, but of course women have testosterone hormones in their bodies as well. And so this is something that would be effective in both women and men, stroke patients.
Yes, well, this is what Ian has shown in the Winner Effect, that this happens, and I suppose it just gives you one small advantage apparently for being able to recover. The other advantages of being in your home are very much the fact that you have the flexibility to do your programs when you want to do them. This might sound like a very inconsequential thing, but one of the biggest problems that patients who've had a stroke get is this idea, this fatigue, or this unusual fatigue that they get. And when you wake up in the morning time, it's a very unpredictable type of fatigue. And patients really, on a day-to-day basis, nearly need to wait until they see how they are in the morning time before they plan out their schedule. And of course, my own experiences from working in rehabilitation centres would be very much that, we schedule patients at certain times to try and fit everybody in. But if I schedule you at 10 o'clock in the morning and you're having a particularly bad bout of tiredness and fatigue on that day, well, then that session possibly doesn't work for you, because it might have been better to see you in the afternoon. And that flexibility doesn't usually exist in a rehabilitation centre or a hospital, but it does in your own home, because you can start your therapy in the evening time, or you can start it in the early afternoon, and you can have regular breaks. And that ability as well is another small little advantage that people would underestimate when they go back home as well.
So do you have a cadre of patients, stroke patients in their home that's part of a research protocol where you're following them over time to see how these techniques of lights, mirror, and action is actually working? So do you have a clinical trial established so you can actually follow this and then get some clear data that these techniques are working?
No, not at this stage, but we've applied for funding to try and use the programs that we've suggested. However, each of the individual therapies that I mention, especially the innovative ones, they would have all been involved in individual trials in our clinic, in our research group over the last 6 or 7 years. So each one of them has evidence that they're safe to use and that they show clinical benefits. But as a whole, as a program, we haven't tried this program to the prescription or the guidance that I've produced it in the book. However, I suppose I wanted to say to people that there's, it's a very difficult thing to prescribe a program. In fact, it's probably not an appropriate thing in one way to do that, because we don't know how people are going to adapt to every different therapy that's out there. So I've had lots of patients who, when they try mirror therapy, for example, they actually don't like it because maybe there's some cognitive issue that's going on with them and they find that hard to understand. Likewise, when I worked with Dr. Frank McCurtain, who I mentioned earlier, when we tried a WE program, which was like a platform that supposedly was helping stroke patients at the time, it was like a virtual reality thing. And I thought this would be fantastic for him, but he hated it the minute he tried it, and that was a huge surprise. So what I'm saying in the book is that there's about 30 different therapies out there that over the years have been proven from a research point of view to be safe, and have also some clinical evidence that they have benefits or potential benefits for people. And stroke patients and their family members, they need to try as many of those as possible to find the ones that they instinctively know help them. And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier on, the getting involved actively in your programs. We know now when people do that, if they have the confidence to do that, that you can sometimes feel better in control of what you're doing. And apparently our outcomes are much better, or we leave ourselves with better potential when we do that. For my book, Lights, Mirrors, Actions, it would have been strange not to at least suggest a starting point for people to go with. So the therapies, I just mentioned 3 of the therapies that came from our research group that I felt could be done in a cost-effective way. But alongside those would be traditional therapies of stretching your sinews and stretching your joints, walking being one of the most important things that you do, and then incorporating regular breaks into it. So what I've suggested is kind of like a 4-week initial program that involves some of those therapies, but at the same time with the proviso that you can try lots of other therapies as well, and they could replace those if these don't, if your instinct is that they won't work for you. So never to, not to suggest that this is the absolute therapy that somebody should take would be incorrect. But what we are hoping is that we'll get the funding, to try some trials where people in their own homes do this particular program and see the feedback that comes from it. Yeah.
Well, how did things turn out with the doctor, the very first one that inspired you onto this journey? Where is he today?
Well, unfortunately, Frank passed away probably about maybe 10 years ago. But unfortunately, it wasn't his stroke that caused that. He ended up having some cancer that caused his death eventually. But probably for the 2 or 3 years after I started working with him, he was a very highly motivated man. He was somebody that, once he had a belief in what you were doing and it sounded logical for him, and you were allowing him to kind of come up with some ideas himself, he would work really, really strong, and it was even the comfort that he had. He was like a different man. His wife would tell you that he was much happier and contented in himself because he kind of felt a little bit more in control. He never got 100%. He never got a full 100% recovery in terms of function of his limbs, but he was able to walk and he was able to function. He was able to do all of his tasks at home. But within himself, he was very contented, and we got on so well that it really inspired me, I have to say.
So, do you have patients today that you point to, or that you talk about in your book, that have followed some of these prescriptions, who have gotten markedly better, who are doing well, who might otherwise not have been doing as well had they not followed some of these prescriptions about home care and having the right attitude, and some of the things that you described in your book?
Most of the patients that I look after over the last probably 2 years or so would be people that would be involved in our clinical trials, Don. So they would be patients. So maybe just to go back a step, you mentioned earlier on that I run a research lab called the Neuroplasticity Research Group in our university. And that group, we've probably raised about $2 million for different projects that was very much related to developing technology that would help patients to recover remotely. So we've created a piece of technology that allows patients to do mirror therapy and do another unusual therapy called cross-education of strengthening. And very briefly, cross-education of strengthening is the idea that if you went to the gym, Don, for the next 6 weeks and we just asked you to strengthen the right side of your body, now, you'd never do that in practice because it would be unusual to do that. But if you did, after the 6 weeks was over, the right side of your body would be very strong and much stronger, as you can imagine. But amazingly, if you measure the left side of your body, you can have anywhere up to 40% of an improvement in strength, even though you haven't done anything. And it's that overlap of neural information that's all the time going and crossing between both sides of the brain. And so it's like a neural adaptation that people get. And that type of a therapy, again, would have great potential for stroke patients, because if you can't move one side of the body, well, the idea that you would move the other side. So what we've developed is a piece of equipment, technology that allows a person to do strengthening with their good side while using mirror therapy. And the trials that we've used that with have shown, that has good potential. But our biggest project, at the moment is the idea of a platform that patients could use. So, rather than if you're being discharged home and you just get, maybe in Ireland, Don, what happens with patients who are discharged home from hospitals, 10% of them are eligible for what they call an early discharge program. And that's where health professionals, so a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, a speech and language therapist, and a clinical nurse specialist would come into their homes, and for 6 weeks they help them with therapy, and it's more intense than if they were going as an outpatient. After 6 weeks or thereabouts, then the team comes out, and the hope is that you've made quite a good recovery at that stage. But for the other 90% of people that are discharged, they may get, they usually are offered maybe an outpatient appointment, but it's usually only once, definitely most twice a week, and that usually pans out very quickly. So rather than that being your scenario, we're working on a platform system that potentially, when you're discharged after your stroke, you're given a code, and you go onto the web, and you open up a platform, which is basically a website, where all of everything that we think you need in terms of your exercises are all on there, with videos and showing you how to do them. All the information that we think psychologically could benefit you, and kind of, for your caregivers and your family members, anything that we think could be useful can be put on there. There's communication ability there, so your therapist, so if I'm in my home where I live, I can arrange and schedule to have meetings with you for when we need to have a discussion. But the equipment that we give you, like the piece that I mentioned to you earlier on, that also has electronics in it that when you use it, so when you use it during the day, and it records everything that you do and then sends that information to a cloud, which downloads onto the platform. So when I potentially wake up in the morning time and I open up my computer, I see my remote patients on there, and I can see if you've actually done your therapy at all. I can see, if you've done it a little bit better than what you were at before. If you don't do it, it maybe raises an alarm in my mind that would there be something going on here that's a bit unusual. And we have some other pieces of equipment that we've developed that also play into that. So we're just at that stage at the moment where we're just about to start some clinical trials with those things. So on paper, it sounds all very good, and potentially it could be good. Maybe they'll show us that they won't work upright, but so far the the suggestions would suggest that there's potential for these things. So you're right. We haven't got the hard. I think if we can get the hard evidence that these things work, well then we're on to a good winner. But if we don't, it'll be like a lot of projects that get so far and never see the light of day.
But at least you're trying, and you're out there trying to help people, and you're getting some successes with it. So we've got to wrap this up here in a few minutes. Tell me, what does the future hold for you, Ken? Is there something you haven't accomplished yet, or something on the horizon that you are looking forward to doing that you haven't been able to achieve before?
I suppose it's my first time to kind of write a book like Lights, Mirrors, Action, and I suppose I'm starting to see now that the feedback that's coming back to me has been, like, it's very interesting when people come and tell you that they've used the book and they've used it or found some benefit in it, and even if it's only just to give them confidence, and a little bit of guidance and things like that. I'm probably, over the last 7 or 8 years, I've been doing very little teaching in my university because most of my time has been supervising postgraduate students, and been involved obviously in writing this. We've a young family. I have an almost 18-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter, so that keeps me very busy as well. I'm not sure. I really love working in the university, and I actually like teaching as well. So I've probably ignored that a little bit over the last 5 or 6 years because it's very hard to have the time to do everything. I've been doing some teaching, but I'm actually back doing a lot more, and I'm actually really enjoying it. Our courses are very much stepping stone courses into physical therapy programs, and I get a lot of enjoyment helping the students or helping to guide them a little bit. I'm hoping that the next phase of our research group will be for projects that involve the likes of the therapies that are involved in this book. And I think 2/3 of what's in this particular book is probably psychological principles as much as anything else. And a lot of those psychological principles would probably would apply to other neurological conditions as well. So, maybe there's somebody listening out there that would be interested in this being applied to Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis disease or whatever. And there's no reason that something like that couldn't be done in the future as well. But we better see how this gets on. And see does it do well or whatever. But overall, I'm very contented with everything that's going on in my life, so I'm very happy.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, especially for people, and I can testify, having cared for a stroke patient for a number of years, of how important this is and how important the work that you happen to be doing is. And I think a lot of people are going to benefit from this now and in the future. And hopefully it evolves into a protocol and a program that people can easily use. So thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us and sharing your research with us. It's just been wonderful getting to know you. And thank you for all the poetry you sent me. I really appreciate it. And I think most people don't know that scientists are very much artists as well as, and appreciate art and literature as well as everything else. And so I really appreciate that. Thanks, Ken, and you have a great rest of the day. Thank you for joining us on this episode of A Journey Through Nature and Science. We've been speaking with Dr. Ken Monahan. His book is Lights, Mirrors, Action. A link to his book is on our website at natureandsciencepodcast.com. Please leave a comment and hit the like button to help us grow the podcast. Now more than ever, it's important to help develop science literacy. Dr. Henry Ehrlich joins us on our next episode. Dr. Ehrlich is a world-renowned scientist, author, educator, and human rights activist. His contributions to the field of DNA research are really groundbreaking. In fact, in the 1980s, he helped pioneer innovative techniques for assessing DNA evidence, revolutionizing the criminal justice system. Under his leadership, he and his colleagues developed the polymerase chain reaction. That's a PCR technology. If you don't know what that is, join us next week and you'll find out. It's really exciting. Again, thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.